Stephan Petermann. And Stephan has a background in architecture and history. He's part of the core of OMA, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture of Rem Koolhaas. And he told us that cities are actually only 2% of the world. So 98% is not an urban space. And actually that blew my mind. Stephan Petermann was one of the associates in charge of Rem Koolhaas' Fundamentals Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2014. And currently he's working on a very interesting research on the future of the countryside in collaboration with two schools, Harvard Graduate School of Design and the Chinese Academy of Fine Arts. A very interesting combination, and I think two very interesting perspectives. The research Stephan is doing claims at making an inventory of political, economical and cultural processes, and I think a lot of other processes as well that come with that, to understand the countryside. And during this BZ lecture, he will present ideas that relate to why and how we can approach the countryside again and differently. Stephan.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you for the great movie. I really enjoyed that. It somehow always ends up with our students, and when working on the countryside, that the first initial response from the students is to grasp Google Earth and zoom in and frantically zoom out to try to locate the countryside on the screen. And it was so beautiful to see it in such a different context and with such a different, beautiful reading. So thank you a lot, Tina and Marieke, for this edition. As mentioned, I'm working for a think tank in Rotterdam, and we're preparing a big exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum next year. And I took the assignment seriously to formulate 5 points that I will try to raise. There are many, many other ones that I would like to and could talk about, but bear with me for the next 20 minutes, please. My first point would be about why we want to go to the countryside. And it relates to the fact that this is the view from my office in Rotterdam in 2016. And I was intensely staring at this landscape, thinking of basically how it would look like in 2036, and actually thinking that it will look like this in 2036. Because if you look at the different buildings, and if you look at their different types of constraints that concern them, regarding ownership, regarding real estate value, regarding heritage positions, regarding public or private, you will notice, I think, that there's a high likelihood that the landscape of the city will be quite the same in a few years' time. There might be a few additions to this landscape of towers, but overall this landscape will not change that dramatically. At the same time, I was also visiting a prototype fair in Amsterdam and found this as the future of living in the city. It's a container house, sort of the idea that you're kind of shrinking and shrinking your own habitat to almost to a 0 point. And then further down the road, a bit also near Rotterdam, there's also frantic attempts of reintroducing the countryside into the city at an almost ridiculous effort. There is a roundabout at the center of Rotterdam, just 2 minutes from my office, where it's officially the most polluted area in Rotterdam. And they are frantically on the roof gardens trying to do urban farming for the restaurant there, which is obviously a good idea. At the same time, it will not really yield the types of serious infrastructure the city needs. And then there is sort of the gentrification of reintroducing parts of countryside nostalgia in cities, like, for example, here these bays or the barn, sort of the fact that the countryside is encroaching deeply into the city, which made it more and more compelling, or even that musea are increasingly looking like countryside architecture. So that's my first point. Why are we interested in the countryside? Because the conditions for an architect in the city are becoming ever more tense, ever more obligated with these type of financial commitments, heritage, etc., rules. And we also wanted to sort of see if there are other things to do. That led basically to a proposal that we started with, basically that in the countryside there is an extremely rational landscape emerging that is needed in order to facilitate the frivolity of the city. So the frivolity of Anish Kapoor can only exist if we organize our countryside in a super brutal, rational way. And you see that everywhere, basically. This is in Idaho, but you see the same types of rationalization in China, where there's a dramatic sense of optimization and efficiency that is needed to sustain all these cities. It also coincides with a desire for flatness, so it does have also a spatial and geometrical proposition underneath it. And it is fueled by a number of very hardcore modern principles. For example, this is a photo I took in the Amazon warehouses in Leipzig, where basically Amazon is trying to, in the countryside, totally shrink the human presence. This is the current facilities of Amazon and the sort of the typical warehouse that they employ, which is normally located into the countryside, where basically all this enormous infrastructure that facilitate our everyday needs of orders and of processing are understood. And what we wanted to do is to try to understand this architecture and try to understand this organization and its potentials, also to not only critique sort of this type of operation, but also to see, is there an artistic dimension or a cultural dimension in them. This is a sketch of a student from Harvard who tried to understand the full logic of this type of Amazon fulfillment centers. The interesting part is this is a 400-meter long building, and this whole section is only used for Christmas. It comes with, obviously, with a lot of standardization. Also, this is the sort of the building particle that is at the center of this type of warehouse conditions. A very strong prefabricated structure built by Amazon, designed by Amazon, and only used by Amazon. And what you see in this process is that the role of the human in this landscape, which you see here, they're becoming more and more obstacles. When we were speaking with the plant managers there, they process around 50,000 orders every day, and there are 2 mistakes, and both are done by humans. So the first priority of Jeff Bezos is to try to see if we can remove the last humans. Also in terms of work, obviously it's not very pleasant work. It's, I remember that sort of there was a shift change, and it felt like this type of military parade that was changing gears. So it's also not a very pleasant landscape, and perhaps it's better if we can employ these type of Kiva robots to do it. This led us to a larger inquiry into this type of new automated landscapes that are emerging. There is an area in Nevada near Sparks, which basically hosts all the infrastructure of Silicon Valley. Because in California you have to pay taxes, and in Nevada you don't pay taxes. You see that a lot is also related to tax. And you see these new types of landscapes emerge, like this one, the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, where an enormous amount of boxes, and these boxes are not very tiny, they can reach up to almost a mile in length. Also Tesla Gigafactory has their production facilities, but also Apple and Amazon. And there's a wholly new landscape emerging, also new interior architecture. For example, this is a server farm that is located there, where obviously the absence of humans means that you can also experiment with things like color, things like temperature, and very basic human conditions can be manipulated because they're not longer that reliant on humans. The humans that you find basically are quite tough guys, as you see here, like ex-military. They all carry guns to sort of protect the data centers, and are sort of the few people that are left in this landscape. And you see that this is in the same building, this is the next door. So they create these type of still romantic reminders of some form of extreme humanism or transcendental Buddhism that facilitate or that lift their spirits perhaps in this landscape. And you wonder if that's the most effective way to do that. For example, just to give you a sense of the scale, this is going to be one of the largest data centers in the world. It's the SuperNAP switch site, and it basically covers the entire center of Siena. So you see really that in terms of scale, there is something new emerging in this landscape. These buildings can sprawl on forever. But unfortunately, at the moment, there's little architecture and little architects involved, where you could see this as a very monumental new assignment for architecture, to see to what extent you can shape this and make something that is worth looking at, or worth considering, or worth also experimenting with. So that's point 2. Point 3 is zooms in at a branch basically of this type of rationalization, which is agriculture. And I go home not so far from where we are now, to the Westland area in the Netherlands, which is this area not so far from Rotterdam, 20 kilometers, and which is completely made out of glass houses. Hopefully, I guess most of you know this area, or at least have heard about it. It's very interesting because it's an area that has seen significant progress. If you look at the yields of, for example, vegetables that are farmed, this is tomatoes and cucumbers, you see that the productivity per hectare has been increased dramatically, and that even Holland can be very proud in terms of its productivity if you compare it to the other basic vegetable producing countries. And it comes down to a small community of which all live in a few kilometer radius, where they are doing very fundamental dramatic research and innovation. For example, we found this container here, which is some of the most radical spaces that I've visited lately. This container is in the backyard of Priva. It's a very big company in maintaining the climate control and all the sensory input for glass houses. And basically this is a tomato farm. It's a tomato farm which is obviously made out of steel. And unfortunately I could not make any photos inside of it, but I hope to show you a bit of how it looks. This is the type of environment, obviously a bit smaller, that you find inside. The light in it is pink. Pink is the light because they take only the parts of the light spectrum that is useful for photosynthesis and only use what the plant really needs. Also, we had a fantastic speech by one of the operators, this guy, who basically gave a very strong statement about how bad nature is. Basically, for tomatoes, the only good sunlight is sunlight in February, because all other sunlight is too intense. It hurts the plants. The earth is dirty. It has all kinds of clutter in it. It has all kinds of irregularities, which the plant doesn't really want. Watering we've been doing for centuries, like in a most disasterful way, is as if somebody kind of empties out an entire lake on top of your head, instead of wanting only the drops that you really need. So he completely killed every part of nature, also in terms of pest control, that the more enclosed you farm, the less pest control you need, because you can externalize all the threats. You can externalize all the viruses, all the fungus, etc. So the more control, the more sustainable your production can be, which is obviously was something that was very, very difficult to comprehend in a fundamental way. It uses a lot of sensors to also indicate or to find out what a plant really wants, and make sure to really give every plant the individual attention that it needs. So this is, I think, again, a very fundamental humanist proposition that is made, even if you think of our current debates in society about equality between people and managing these things. These innovations are really at the core of part of, I think, the human spirit. These are, for example, how you regulate a system like that. And then a secondary branch that we look at the tomato itself and how it evolved, and also what is the potential of the tomato, and what are the colors, directions, and variations that you can make out of them. The fourth section is a section that is more done by one of my colleagues. It looks at the relationship between mankind and wildlife. And it takes place mostly in Africa, where there's obviously an enormous demographic boom happening, where there's the expected population will likely double, so there will just be enormous expansion in terms of territory inside of the countryside. It's probably one of the countrysides in the world which will change a lot. And it means obviously also a lot. This is my colleague Niklas Mark from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. He's taking responsibility of this section, where he, together with people from the Max Planck Institute, investigate the behavior of both gorillas and farmers, who are increasingly needing land because they need to grow more crops, basically, and they want to grow more crops, but they're consistently trying to find more space to actually grow, and it's coming much closer to the gorillas, and it leads to very interesting dilemmas whether to prioritize the gorilla population or the human population. For example, this is what we know from the 1960s of how gorillas used to be studied, and now part to pay for the economic uplifting of Africa is the increasing numbers of tourists. So now, basically, the gorilla is increasingly surrounded by tourists, which is creating new effects on the psychology of the gorilla and also the social behaviors of the gorillas. And in terms of the debate or trying to regulate, basically, the relationship between the farmers and the gorillas, the government is planning these types of buffer zones where they hope that the gorillas will stay out to keep them into the forest, to not raid the crops of the land, but that's so far it's not very successful. They planted these thorn hedges, and they also, I think, they planted some eucalyptus trees, because they thought it would repel the gorillas, that they would not go through the thorns and they would not like the eucalyptus. But then they did, but actually then it turned out that the gorillas liked the thorns because they could scratch their back. And then actually also they liked to have the eucalyptus, and then they went further down into the field and eat basically more and more crops. So a completely new landscape is emerging there, which has obviously very dramatic effects and also consequences. We have to renegotiate the position between man and wildlife, and perhaps also renegotiate the idea of what a park can be. Then the last section I will briefly talk about is the work that we do with CAFA in Beijing, where the government, and it's increasingly clear that the urban situations in China are not sustainable. The cities are slightly collapsing. If you talk about shrinkage, Shanghai is the first city to be shrinking. Its inner city just cannot handle the pressure anymore. Also in terms of living conditions are quite poor in the big cities. So government is very active in trying to negotiate on that position and trying to get people back into the countryside. And we are trying to look at that in terms of its design in the whole context of the Chinese nation, where we try to look at a number of themes like preservation, politics and agriculture, to see what types of new investments and not what types of new involvement into the countryside are actually happening. Where we look at 8 villages, where we try to see to what extent these type of images of the past, in terms of the propaganda, etc., of how they work nowadays. It is a national priority. This is a recent declaration of Xi Jinping, who's made the countryside its #1 priority in terms of developing, which has got many people very excited, particularly also in my studio, because they know that the government is backing something, and that means in China serious work. And we are trying to find this new landscape of the countryside. This is, for example, a new village that is currently being built that is totally centered around e-commerce. It's called a Taobao village. It's the Chinese equivalent of eBay. And they are building sort of these new types of settlements in rural areas to encourage the local economy. But you also find very different ways that transformation is happening. For example, these are towers where the farmers are living, who are working the land that we looked at earlier, this totally rational landscape of greenhouses. They are all operated by farmers who live in these type of towers. Before going to China, I never heard of a farmer living in a tower. But they drive their SUV in the morning outside of the parking garage, go to the greenhouse, do the farming, and at 6 o'clock close off and go home and live in their urban life. So you also see a strange new hybrid emerging between urban and rural citizens. Then there's an enormous tourism boom happening in the Chinese countryside. Almost half of the tourism in China is to the countryside, where completely new old villages are being constructed. This is north of Beijing, is a newly built old village where sort of this is a hybrid of northern and southern traditional architecture, which is surrounded by more generic housing and generic modern hotels. And with the added value of these places, they fund the actual development of the old center of this city. So there's a sort of a feedback loop in terms of that you create one that feeds on the other. That is, I think, a very, very interesting model. And then lastly, to close, we are also looking at different ways in which the government operates its land. For example, this is one of the last standing communist communes that still exists in China, which is still following the original communist doctrine, and has actually created a very wealthy and a quite luxurious condition where an average family gets a house of 400 square meters, and everything is free in terms of housing, in terms of museums, in terms of schooling, etc. So it shows you that there are a lot of different forms of countryside and also life in the countryside. This is something we want to show in this exhibition. These are some glimpses of the research that we are doing. There's obviously much more, but I would like to leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephan. I actually don't know where to start because there is just so much. But where do you set the boundaries for yourself? Is there like a frame? Where do you say, okay, we won't use this?
No, that's a bit of a particular problem. Because our sphere of influence and the sphere of interest is, in essence, endless. And it's always a matter of, but we also need to talk about migration, because obviously it's a super crucial topic for the time. Climate change couldn't show now, but we also have a big section on the changing condition of Russian permafrost. And then sort of things keep amassing, but at the same time, to do something properly, you need to be able to focus. So it's a constant dilemma.
It's incredible. So you actually, China, you have a colleague in the sub-Saharan area. You talk about tourism, ecology, biology. It's quite incredible. Who is actually, where do you hope this research will be used in? Is it also, do you also give a vision for the future?
Yes, and what we hope, I think, is to create a more level playing field between urban and rural communities. And also
how do you mean, like a more level playing field?
To make, normally when I go to events, specifically for, let's say, that are more towards the countryside, like tractor fairs or, places where it's just very uncommon now that anybody who has a cultured background is showing up. And you have to, normally they look at you as if you come from Mars. And I would like to change that to some extent, to make it slightly more easy also for architects, for example, to be involved in projects. And it's not only about our own company, it's more about the profession, that the profession has this enormous added world part where it's not invited, but somehow we have to try to see if we can get invited into this world.
Because otherwise the whole periphery, the whole countryside will end up being ugly containers, or is that the fear?
Yeah, can definitely happen. I mean, it's not out of this. Already substantial parts are organized like that, and I'm not against containers, but definitely not. But they could be much more
nice.
Yeah, I mean, some of them, these projects have the scale of land art, so why not make it into then a land art which has sort of a functional component, or also even a poetic and a mythological or ideological proposition inside of it.
So the aim is actually quite artistic then, or there is a
artistic dimension to, or at least an aesthetic dimension, a programmatic dimension. Also, how can you avoid the Buddha-esque condition of these workers? Could you give them something that is more exciting? Also to renegotiate your own position as a human. So what, and also the position of the human in architecture. So because the profession has always been organized around the idea that everything has sort of a scale and a shape that resonates with people. What if you can take parts of the human out of that equation? What does it generate? What kind of form? And I think that can be quite an exciting challenge.
Yes. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, I see one hand. Yeah.
Okay, good. The villages that you were showing in China, some of them, it appears, particularly this kind of eBay village.
The Taobao village you showed. Yeah.
Historically, there has been a problem with these kind of one industry cities, you know, coal and mining and manufacturing. Eventually it comes to a point where they collapse because the world changes. Even if we think technology will continue, who knows? How is it possible then to think about like a potential future? Because yeah, it's difficult if you focus on one area.
I'll just repeat the question for somebody who might not have heard it. So you actually asked about the future of these very specific monoculture spaces, like for example the Taobao village, the Chinese Amazon village you showed. Your question was if do you also think about the future of those places?
Yeah, and in this particular Taobao village it is a big problem. Because it's a furniture village. I just finished an article, it will be in Vrij Nederland.
It's already there, I read it.
Oh, right, okay, great. It's already there. And they have a particular problem with their furniture line, but there's also other Taobao villages which have actually, there's a stone cutting village in the west of China which has a history of 3,000 years of stone cutting. So for them it's really just a slight manipulation in the total equation of a tradition that is really, really old. I think there's a lot to be gained in the Taobao system, and also in making sure that these things are resilient. Because also in that village there's an enormous amount of competition between villagers, and the social cohesion in the village has deteriorated since the introduction of Taobao. At the same time, economically, it's prosperous as hell. So there's a lot of things that need to be, it has a turnover that went from 0 to tens of millions of dollars. So there is
prosperous now, though.
Yeah.
You know,
how to sustain it? I think there is a larger shift in the Chinese economy happening where they try to move from quantity to quality, and I think that would be the most ideal situation, that they would try to focus on more sustainable, high-quality design work that you can sell for more money and still have a prosperous, live in a prosperous condition.
So
that would be my hope.
So yeah, so you have a positive hope. You have positive hopes for the future.
Yes, yes. In general, I think countryside is very easy to put away as something that is going backwards and that is sort of problematic, etc. But there are huge things that are also simply growing, and yeah, I would really at every point try to avoid getting it into some form of oh, I'm so sorry, and it's all going not so well. I would really try to encourage things that are growing and try to innovate with them and make them more visible and make them more alive.
Any other questions? Because, of course, we all want cheap cucumbers and tomatoes, eh? Right?
They're also nice, the tomatoes in the container. I tasted them, they're really good.
Yes, because, for example, it's not only these containers where the tomatoes are grown, but also you also need housing for cheap labor there. So I don't think we can really take our hands off what is happening to the countryside.
No, exactly. It is a huge area where the city benefits a lot from without ever setting a foot on the ground, or without ever having. I mean, there is a lean sort of a desire to know where your food comes from, to some extent, as long as it fulfills a bit of a romantic idea of production, then it's nice to know. But then afterwards, the all rest we try to avoid, and that's something that is indeed not sustainable, I think, in many ways.
Do we have a too romantic view of the countryside? Do we want a sticker of a smiling cow on our beef and then think, okay,
yeah,
well, it's actually not.
Many times, yeah, I think so. And a lot of, at least in general, I would say yes. There's also far more fundamental research being done about agriculture in Wageningen University, where they also look at, what do actually cows want? Do they want to have this type of romantic environment? But apparently they don't really like that too much. They think that the inside of the barn is nicer than the outside most of the time. So indeed we have to readjust also parts of our own perspective.
So in the meantime, Wiede Verknokke, he's drawing a cow. Wiede, you have been drawing, you will be drawing the whole night. What have you drawn so far?
Tomato cow here. So I think the tomato hasn't been asked if it's nice to be in such a small container. I think a human wouldn't like it. It's one aspect. I see the future, but the share is manufactured wrong. It's also an idea. The thing I liked was the urban cities, the cities with farmers living in apartments, growing their crops, whilst there was people leaving the cities. Never heard that before. Nobody asked buildings if they're worth looking at. So no building shaming also. Like the Anish Kapoor in juxtaposition with the strict building style. The periphery is an idea. Then the countryside, yeah. Oh, everybody loves the countryside. And then, but where is the countryside?
Yes, where is the countryside? Yes, thank you so much, Wiede. I'm looking forward to the rest.